In 2013, a quiet voice stood on the stage of Britain's Got Talent and stopped an entire room without raising its volume. There was no big entrance, no loud confidence, just a soft presence and a song that felt deeply personal. For a moment, millions believed they were watching the start of something lasting. But not long after that moment, she seemed to fade from the path people expected. What followed was not failure, and not exactly success either, but something far more complex and rarely talked about. Before anyone outside her small circle knew her name, Alice Fredenham lived a life that was steady, quiet, and largely unnoticed. She worked as a beauty therapist in London, spending her days in close, calm spaces with clients, far away from anything that looked like a stage. It was a routine life, one that many people live without ever imagining it could suddenly change. What stood out about her was not just her voice, but how she carried herself. She was naturally shy. Speaking in front of others did not come easily to her. Even in simple conversations, there was a softness, almost a hesitation. People around her noticed her talent, but she did not push it forward. Singing was something she held close, not something she used to seek attention. Music, for her, was personal. It was not about being heard by a crowd. It was more like a quiet place she could return to when things felt uncertain. In that sense, her relationship with music was very different from many who dream of performing. It was not driven by ambition. It was driven by comfort. There's also a detail that often goes unnoticed. Before her well-known appearance, she had already tried to step into that world once. She had auditioned before, but it did not lead anywhere. That early experience did not create determination in the usual way. Instead, it quietly lowered her expectations. When she returned, she did not come with strong belief or confidence. She came with uncertainty. This matters more than it first appears. When someone enters a public stage without a strong sense of self-belief, the experience can feel very different. Instead of feeling ready, they may feel exposed. Instead of control, there could be a sense of being carried by something they do not fully understand. At that point in her life, Alice was not preparing for fame. She was simply taking a step that felt both small and significant at the same time. From the outside, it might have looked like the beginning of something big. But from where she stood, it was just a quiet attempt, without any clear expectation of what would follow. And that contrast between a quiet inner world and what was about to come would shape everything that followed. But once she stepped onto that stage again, something shifted instantly, and it brought a level of attention she had never prepared for. When Alice Fredenham walked onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent, the first thing people noticed was not confidence, but hesitation. Her body language was careful, almost unsure. Her voice, when she spoke to the judges, carried a slight tremble. It felt like she was stepping into a space that didn't quite belong to her. At that moment, expectations were low. There was nothing loud or attention-grabbing about her presence. But that changed within seconds of her beginning to sing. Her voice did not try to overpower the room. It moved gently, controlled, and full of feeling. It was not just technically strong, it felt personal. The kind of performance that does not demand attention but quietly holds it. The room responded in a way that was rare for a show built on fast reactions and big moments. It became still. That stillness was important. It created a different kind of focus. Instead of excitement, there was attention. Instead of noise, there was listening. And in that silence, her performance became more than just a song. It became a moment people felt connected to. Very quickly, that moment spread beyond the stage. Clips of her audition were shared widely. People talked about her voice, but also about her presence, her shyness, her softness, the contrast between how she appeared and what she delivered. She stood out not because she tried to, but because she didn't. But this kind of attention carries something with it. Without realizing it, the audience began to shape an image of her. She was seen as fragile, pure, and deeply emotional. These ideas were not created by her directly, but they became attached to her identity in the public eye. That can be difficult to carry. When a person is seen in a certain way by millions, it creates silent expectations. Not just about performance, but about how they should behave, how they should feel, and even how they should continue their journey. For someone like Alice, who had already been unsure of herself, this sudden shift could feel overwhelming. She was no longer just singing. She was being watched, interpreted, and remembered in a very specific way. Her audition opened a door. It gave her recognition, opportunity, and a kind of connection with the audience that many performers spend years trying to build. But at the same time, it placed her into a role she had never prepared for. And as the competition continued, that quiet pressure began to grow in ways that were not always visible, but slowly started to change how people saw her. After that first moment, expectations around Alice Fredenham changed quietly but quickly. Her audition had created a strong impression, one that stayed with the audience. But in a competition like Britain's Got Talent, each performance is compared not only to others, but to what came before. And in her case, that first moment became something difficult to match. As she moved forward in the show, the environment around her became more intense. There were rehearsals, schedules, and constant preparation. The pace was faster, and the space for quiet reflection became smaller. For someone who had once kept music as a private experience, this shift was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Her later performances were still gentle and emotional, but the reaction began to change. Some people felt they did not carry the same impact as her audition. This is a common pattern in talent shows, but for the person going through it, it can feel very different. It creates a quiet kind of pressure, one that builds without being fully visible. There's also a psychological side to this. When someone enters a situation with low confidence, early praise can feel surprising rather than stabilizing. It does not always create a strong sense of belief. Instead, it can create fear of not being able to meet expectations again. That fear can affect how a person performs, even if their ability has not changed. Alice's natural shyness did not disappear as the show continued. In some ways, it became more noticeable, being watched more closely, being discussed more widely. It added a layer of awareness that is not easy to carry. Each performance was no longer just about singing. It became tied to how she was being seen and understood by others. Her journey on the show came to an end sooner than many viewers expected. From the outside, it looked like a sudden change. But from her position, it may have felt like the weight had slowly been building over time. Leaving the stage brought a different kind of quiet. The spotlight was gone, but the experience did not disappear with it. What remained was something more complex, a mix of recognition, expectation, and personal reflection. Because stepping away from that stage did not mean returning to the life she had before. Instead, it placed her in a space that felt uncertain, somewhere between being known and not fully being part of that world anymore. After leaving Britain's Got Talent, Alice Fredenham entered a phase that is rarely shown, but often felt. The stage was no longer part of her daily life, yet the effects of it remained. She was no longer competing, but she was also no longer unknown. This created a quiet in-between space that could be difficult to understand from the outside. In the weeks and months that followed, there was still interest around her. People remembered her audition. They searched for updates, looked for new performances, and expected something more to come. This is a common pattern after a strong first impression. The audience does not always move on at the same pace as the person who lived the experience. There were opportunities, but they came with expectations. Releasing music, appearing publicly, staying visible, these are often seen as the natural next steps. But each of these requires a certain level of comfort with attention. For someone who had never fully adjusted to being in the spotlight, this path was not simple. She had to continue with music in some form. There were recordings and small projects that showed her voice was still present in her life. But these moments did not carry the same level of attention as her first appearance. This is another reality of sudden exposure. Viral moments do not always lead to lasting visibility. Behind the scenes, this phase often becomes a time of reflection. It is when a person begins to understand what the experience meant to them beyond what it looked like to others. For Alice, this may have been a time of asking quiet questions. What does she want from music now? What kind of life feels right after being seen by so many? Returning fully to her previous life was not easy either. Once someone has been recognized on a large scale, even briefly, it changes how they move through the world. There is a sense of being remembered, even in places where nothing has changed. This chapter is not about a sudden fall or a clear rise. It is about a space that sits between both, a place where identity is being reshaped slowly and privately. And instead of pushing further into the spotlight, she began to move in a different direction, one that was quieter and not immediately understood by those watching from the outside. Over time, the public presence of Alice Fredenham became less visible. It did not happen all at once. There was no clear moment where everything stopped. Instead, it was a gradual shift. Fewer appearances, fewer updates, and longer periods where her name was not in active conversation. From the outside, it looked like she was slowly stepping away. But this kind of step back is not always about leaving something behind. In many cases, it is about moving towards something that feels more stable. For someone who had entered the public eye without fully seeking it, the constant attention may not have felt natural. The expectations, even when positive, can create a quiet pressure that does not go away easily. One important detail in her story is that she did not try to force visibility. Many people in similar situations push harder to stay relevant. They increase their presence, take on more appearances, and try to hold on to attention. Alice did not follow that path. Her approach was different. It suggested a decision that was more personal than strategic. There were still small signs that music remained part of her life, but it appeared in a different way. It was no longer centered around large audiences or public recognition. It seemed to return to something closer to what it had been before, private, controlled, and meaningful on a smaller scale. From a psychological point of view, this shift can be seen as a form of protection. When someone feels overwhelmed by exposure, stepping back allows them to regain a sense of control. It creates space to think, to breathe, and to reconnect with who they are outside of public perception. However, stepping away does not remove everything that came before. The memory of that moment on stage, the recognition, and the expectations, they do not disappear completely. They remain in the background, shaping how a person sees themselves and how others remember them. To the public, it may have seemed like she faded, but from another perspective, she may have been choosing a life that felt more manageable, even if it was less visible. Still, this kind of decision often comes with its own quiet weight, because while it brings distance from pressure, it can also create distance from something that once felt meaningful. And that balance between peace and possibility is not always easy to hold over time. As time moved forward, the story of Alice Fredenham began to settle into something quieter than most people expected. There were no big headlines, no constant updates, and no clear return to the kind of stage where her journey first became known. From the outside, it may have looked like her path had slowed down, but from a closer view, it may have simply changed direction. Success is often seen in very visible ways: large audiences, frequent appearances, and continued attention. But not everyone measures their life in the same way. For Alice, the meaning of success may have shifted after her experience on Britain's Got Talent. Instead of being about how many people were watching, it may have become about how she felt within herself. There is a lesser-known truth about many people who experience sudden exposure. Once the intensity fades, they begin to notice how much of their life was shaped by outside expectations. In that quiet space afterward, there's often a need to rebuild a sense of control. This can lead to choices that seem unusual to others, but feel necessary to the person making them. For Alice, this may have meant allowing music to remain in her life without placing it under constant public pressure. Singing could exist again as something personal, something that did not require approval or attention. In this way, her relationship with music may have returned to where it began: simple, private, and meaningful. This kind of life does not often attract attention. It does not create headlines or ongoing discussion, but it can offer something else: stability, a chance to live without the constant need to meet expectations that were never fully her own. Her journey, when viewed this way, is not about stepping away from success. It is about redefining it, choosing a path that may be smaller in scale, but more aligned with who she is. Still, even within that quieter life, there's often a lingering question. Because once someone has experienced being seen and heard on such a large level, that memory does not disappear. And somewhere within that memory, there remains a quiet thought about what could have been and whether that path was ever truly meant to continue. Today, Alice Fredenham remains a name that quietly stays in people's memory. Years have passed since her appearance on Britain's Got Talent, yet her audition continues to be revisited, shared, and remembered. That alone says something important. Her impact was not built on long-term visibility, but on a single moment that connected deeply with people. What makes her story different now is the absence of clear updates. There is very little public information about her daily life. No consistent media presence, no steady stream of releases, and no clear attempt to return to the spotlight in a major way. This silence creates curiosity, but it also reflects something more intentional. In many cases, when public figures step away, their absence is explained or filled with speculation. But in her case, there is very little noise around it. That quietness suggests a decision that does not need constant explanation. It shows a form of distance, not just from the spotlight, but from the expectations that come with it. There are still small signs that music has not completely left her life. Occasional mentions, past recordings, and a memory of her voice continue to exist. But these are not presented in a way that seeks attention. They exist more as traces than as a public effort. This creates a unique kind of presence. She is not fully visible, but she is not forgotten either. It places her in a space where her story feels unfinished. Not because something is missing, but because it does not follow the usual pattern people expect. Psychologically, this leaves behind a different kind of reflection. Her journey is not about loss or failure. It is about choice, quiet, personal, and not always explained. It challenges the idea that every moment of recognition must lead to something bigger. Instead, it shows that sometimes a person steps away not because they cannot continue, but because they choose a different way to live. And that is where her story remains. Not fully closed, not fully visible, but still present in a quiet way. Because in the end, the real question is no longer what happened to her, but whether she found the kind of life that felt right, even if the world stopped watching. Some stories don't end with a clear answer. They slowly move into quieter spaces where choices matter more than attention. And sometimes understanding those choices tells us more than any headline ever could.